Hello and welcome back to my channel. I hope you are well. Today's article is written by Andy Dilks, who is the author of our children's books. If you would like to support the channel, links to my children's books are available in the description below. Today's article is based on the Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, which is one of my favourite books. Let me know in the comments if you see any similarities with what is happening currently. Okay, let's get started. Alexander Solzhenitsyn's three-volume masterpiece, The Gulag Archipelago, stands as a testament to the horrors of the Soviet communist ideology and deserves to be read far and wide, and understood for what it implies in an era of political polarization and intolerance. As a testimonial to those who suffered under the tyranny of Stalin's regime for decades, it is a powerful indictment of dictatorship. At the same time, it's shot through with a streak of dark humour which reminds us just how resilient the human spirit can be in the face of oppression. Perhaps more than anything else, the Gulag Archipelago is a warning against the conformity of tyranny. Far from a population cowering underneath a looming jackboot, it reveals the willing participants in the machinery of totalitarian structures, summed up in perhaps the most famous passage from the book. If only it were so simple. If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being, and who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart? 1. Arrests and quotas. One of the fundamental problems with all attempts at social engineering, whether authoritarian in intention or not, is the inevitability of quotas. Social engineers have a tendency to be far more obsessed with statistical achievements than they are with the actual human cost of their policies. And the same could be said of the Soviets and their constant waves of arrests. The Soviets preferred night arrests, and most of all for several reasons. They would catch the suspect off guard, neighbours wouldn't see how many had been taken, as if the arrests had never taken place, but many other approaches to arrests were tailored for the occasion. Work arrests, arrests during a journey, first time and repeat arrests, and arrests of groups. Those making the arrests would do so in all manner of disguises, and it was only when the bicyclist or conductor or mailman revealed the maroon-coloured identification card did the person realise it was too late. The innocence or guilt of the person being arrested rarely, if ever, mattered, just so long as the quotas were made. Solzhenitsyn describes one account which captures the absurdity of arrests in Soviet Russia. In 1937, a woman came to the reception room of the Novocherkassk NKVD, an early form of the KGB, to ask what she should do about the unfed, unweaned infant of a neighbour who'd been arrested. They said, "Sit down, we'll find out." She sat there for 2 hours, whereupon they took her and tossed her into a cell. They had a total plan which had to be fulfilled in a hurry, and there was no one available to send out into the city, and here it was, the woman already in their hands. 2. The nature of the interrogation. Once arrested, it didn't take long for the Kafkaesque nightmare of interrogations, trials, and tribunals to begin. The interrogators were skilled at manipulating the words of the accused, or simply altering them entirely to achieve the desired outcome, using torture and other interrogation methods as if on a whim, since there was no necessity for such cruelty when the system would inevitably produce a guilty verdict. Referencing the great Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky, Solzhenitsyn states in Crime and Punishment, Porfiry Petrovich makes a surprising astute remark to Raskolnikov to the effect that he could have been found out only by someone who had himself gone through the same cat-and-mouse game, implying, so to speak, I don't even have to construct my own version with you intellectuals. You will put it together and bring me it all wrapped up. Yes, that's so. An intellectual cannot reply with the delightful incoherence of Chekhov's malefactor. He is bound to try to build up in a logical form the whole story he's been accused of, no matter how much falsehood it contains. But the interrogator butcher isn't interested in logic. He just wants to catch 2 or 3 phrases. He knows what he wants, and for us, we are totally unprepared for anything. As for what motivates the interrogator, Solzhenitsyn reduces largely to the dynamics of power, which is more than simply attractive, it's intoxicating. Combined with Stalin's insatiable desire for the expulsion of a never-ending supply of enemies, and the result was an explosion of resentment and rage towards the maliciously stubborn prisoners who opposed being fitted into the totals, who would not capitulate to sleeplessness or the punishment cell or hunger. By refusing to confess, they menaced the interrogator's personal standing. It was as though they wanted to bring him down. In such circumstances, all measures were justified. If it's to be war, then war it will be. We'll ram the tube down your throat, swallow the salt water. 3. Tribunals and revolutionary law. If the accused was lucky enough to get the opportunity to stand before a court of law, the hope of a positive outcome was no doubt swiftly squashed by the realization that the law no longer meant giving them a fair shot at justice. This was a new Russia, not to be bound with concepts from a bygone era. They had thrown out the Tsarist codes, and they had not composed their own. Don't tell me our criminal courts ought to act exclusively on the basis of existing written norms. We live in the process of revolution. A tribunal is not the kind of court in which fine points of jurors' prudence and clever stratagems can be restored. We are creating a new law and a new ethical norms. And also, no matter how much is said here about the eternal law of truth, justice, etc., we know how dearly those have cost us. Solzhenitsyn puts this into simpler words. The reason that fine points of jurors' prudence are unnecessary is there's no need to clarify whether the defendant is guilty or not guilty. The concept of guilt is an old bourgeois concept which has now been uprooted. 4. Lenin versus the insects. The dehumanization of the perceived enemy of the state is a prerequisite for most dictatorships, and revolutionary Russia was no exception. But this didn't begin with the ascent of Stalin to the upper echelons of the Soviet apparatus, it began with Lenin. At the end of 1917, Lenin strove to establish a strict revolutionary order and demanded merciless suppression at attempts at anarchy on the part of drunkards, hooligans, counter-revolutionaries and other persons. The ordering of this list implies that basic law and order on the streets was Lenin's priority, but his essay How to Organize the Competition suggested a more broad and thorough interpretation of the problem, in which the revolutionary purpose was the purging the Russian land of all kinds of harmful insects. As with many authoritarians who use the dehumanizing language of insects, rats or cockroaches, precisely which members of society belonged in this category was open to interpretation, as was the appropriate method of dealing with them. Solzhenitsyn elaborates. True, the forms of insect purging which Lenin conceived of in his essay were most varied. In some places they would be placed under arrest, in other places set to cleaning latrines, in some, after having served their time in the punishment cells, they would be handed yellow tickets. In others, parasites would be shot. Elsewhere you could take your pick of imprisonment or punishment at forced labour of the hardest kind. 5. Stalin versus the kulaks. Whereas Lenin took the language of the animal and applied it to the people he wished to oppress, Stalin would take the politically charged terminology of the time and twist it to justify mass murder and deliberately inflicted widespread famine by conflating the term kulaks with the entire peasantry. Prior to the revolution, the kulaks had struggled out of serfdom and been able to acquire a small amount of land they could call their own, which naturally in the eyes of Stalin put them into the category of bourgeois exploiter of the common people. In reality, they were often simply the most competent and hard-working members of these rural communities, but the waves of repression soon inevitably washed over those who were not among the dispossessed kulaks. The inflation of the scathing term kulak proceeded relentlessly, and by 1930 all strong peasants in general were being so called. All peasants strong in management, strong in work, or even strong merely in convictions. The term kulak was used to smash the strength of the peasantry. 6. Clapping your way to the Gulag. Being a card-carrying member of the Communist Party was, Of course, no guarantee of safety from either the Gulag or a bullet to the head. Internal purges were commonplace, and loyal party members would find themselves in trouble on the most spurious grounds. Solzhenitsyn provides a blackly comic example in the Gulag Archipelago. A district party conference was underway in Moscow province. It was presided over by a new secretary of the district party committee, replacing one recently arrested. At the conclusion of the conference, a tribute to Comrade Stalin was called for. Of course, everyone stood up, just as everyone had leapt to his feet during the conference at every mention of his name. The small hall echoed with stormy applause, rising to an ovation. For 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes, the stormy applause rising to an ovation continued, but palms were getting sore and raised arms were already aching, and the older people were panting from exhaustion. It was becoming insufferably silly, even to those who really adored Stalin. However, who would dare to be the first to stop? The secretary of the district party committee could have done it. He was standing on the platform, and it was he who had called for the ovation, but he was a newcomer. He had taken the place of a man who'd been arrested. He was afraid. After all, NKVD men were standing in the hall applauding and watching to see who will quit first. And in that obscure small hall, unknown to the leader, the applause went on. 6, 7, 8 minutes. They were done for. Their goose was cooked. They couldn't stop now till they collapsed with heart attacks. At the rear of the hall, which was crowded, they could of course cheat a bit, clap less frequently, less vigorously, not so eagerly, but up there with the presidium, where everyone could see them. The director of the local paper factory, an independent and strong-minded man, stood with the presidium. Aware of all the falsity and all the impossibility of the situation, he kept on applauding. 9 minutes, 10. In anguish, he watched the secretary of the district party committee, but the latter dared not stop. Insanity to the last man, with make-believe enthusiasm on their faces, looking at each other with faint hope. The district leaders were just going on, applauding till they fell where they stood, till they were carried out of the hall on stretchers, and even those who were left would not falter. Then, after 11 minutes, the director of the paper factory assumed a business-like expression and sat down in his seat, and oh, what a miracle took place! Where he had the universal, uninhibited, indescribable enthusiasm gone. To a man, everyone else stopped dead and sat down. They had been saved. The squirrel had been smart enough to jump off his revolving wheel. That, however, was how they discovered who the independent people were. And that was how they went about eliminating them. The same night the factory director was arrested. They easily pasted 10 years on him on the pretext of something quite different. But after he'd signed the Form 206, the final document of the interrogation, his interrogator reminded him, "Don't ever be the first to stop applauding." 7. Ideological justifications for evil. As touched upon in his analysis of the motives of the interrogator, Solzhenitsyn decries the simplistic explanation of the horrors of communism being carried out by evildoers, dismissing such rationalizations as permissible to portray evildoers in a story for children so as to keep the picture simple. The villains of Shakespeare, Schiller and Dickens were all well and good for fiction, but they recognize themselves as evildoers and they know their souls are black. In reality, this isn't the way things work, and in Solzhenitsyn's experiences, quite the opposite is the case. To do evil, a human being must first of all believe that he is doing good, or else that is a well-considered fact in conformity with natural law. Fortunately, it is in the nature of human beings to seek a justification for his actions. The most dangerous justification of them all in Solzhenitsyn's eyes was ideology. Ideology is what gives evil-doing its long-sought justification and gives the evildoer the necessary steadfastness and determination. That is the social theory which helps to make his act seem good instead of bad in his own or others' eyes, so that he won't hear reproaches and curses but will receive praise and honours. Thanks to ideology, the 20th century was fated to experience evil-doing on a scale calculated in the millions. 8. Hunger strikes and justice. Before the Russian Revolution, prisoners incarcerated under the Tsarist regime would sometimes employ the hunger strike as a method of achieving personal demands in the hope of some improvements in their conditions. By the 1930s, the hunger strike had been banned as a method of resistance. Those who ignored the ruling and proceeded to go on hunger strike anyway were to undergo forced artificial feeding using a method previously employed on wild animals in captivity. Artificial feeding has much in common with rape, Solzhenitsyn explains, and that's what it really is. 4 big men hurl themselves on one weak being and deprive it of its one interdiction. They only need to do it once, and what happens to it next is not important. Sometimes a prisoner on a hunger strike was accused of continuing their counter-revolutionary activity in prison and was punished with a new prison term. One particular instance illustrated once again how darkly comic the entire situation had become, and how far away from any sense of moral core those who carried out the orders had gone. When, in 1960, Gennady Smirnov, a non-political offender, declared a lengthy hunger strike in the Leningrad prison, the prosecutor went to his cell for some reason, perhaps he was making his regular rounds, and asked him, "Why are you torturing yourself?" And Smirnov replied, "Justice is more precious to me than life." This phrase so astonished the prosecutor with its irrelevance that the very next day Smirnov was taken to Leningrad Special Hospital, i.e. an insane asylum for prisoners, and the doctor there told him, "We suspect you may be schizophrenic." 9. The consequences of submitting to fate. One often wonders when faced with historical examples of totalitarian brutality and campaigns of genocide, why more people didn't resist the tyranny. Easier said than done, particularly when the evidence shows, whether discussing Stalin's Russia, Mao's China or Hitler's Germany, that most people were willing to go along with the regime far more readily than they were to oppose it. The Soviet Union was no exception. Whether the free man living in Soviet society, perhaps awaiting that nocturnal knock on the door, or a prisoner of the authorities, submissive to fate, the total abdication of your own will in the shaping of your life, the recognition that it was impossible to guess the best and worst ahead of time, but that it was easy to take a step you could reproach yourself for. All this freed the prisoner from any bondage, made him calmer, and even ennobled him. This air of general submissiveness had inevitable consequences. Thus many were shot, thousands at first, then hundreds of thousands. We divide, we multiply, we sign, we curse, but still and all these are just numbers. They overwhelm the mind and then are easily forgotten. And if someday the relatives of those who had been shot were to send one publisher photographs of their executed kin, and an album of those photographs were to be published in several volumes, then just by leafing through them and looking at the extinguished eyes, we would learn much that would be valuable for the rest of our lives. Such reading, almost without words, would leave a deep mark on our hearts for eternity. 10. Losing everything and achieving full communism. Volume 1 of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago only begins to touch upon the gulags themselves towards the very end, after focusing for the most part on the machinery of bureaucracy which facilitated the constant stream of new inmates towards the camps. Temporary communists who decry the flaws in the current capitalist system would do well to take note of the following passage, and contemplate the validity of their common retort. That wasn't real communism, in reference to the crimes of Stalin, Mao and others. Far from being an aberration, the repression, the camps, the totalitarian structure is seen by Solzhenitsyn as the apotheosis of communism. Discussing the new arrivals at one of the camps, he explained, but first the authorities would put them up in Magadan, also in Arctic tents, and would commission them there too. In other words, examine them naked to determine their fitness for labour, from the condition of their buttocks, and all of them would be turned out to be fit. In addition, of course, they would be taken to a bath in the bath vestibule, and they would be ordered to leave their leather coats, their Romanov sheepskin coats, their woolen sweaters, their suits of fine wool, their felt cloaks, their leather boots, their felt boots, for after all, these were no illiterate peasants at the time but the party elite, editors of newspapers, directors of trusts and factories, responsible officials in the provincial party committees, professors of political economy, and by the beginning of the 30s, all of them understood what good merchandise was. And who is going to guard them? The newcomers asked sceptically. Oh, come now, who needs your things? The bath personnel acted offended. Go on in, don't worry. And they did go in, and the exit was through a different door, and after passing through it they received black cotton breeches, field shirts, camp quilted jackets without pockets, and pigskin shoes. Where are our things? They cried. Your things you left at home, some chief or other bellowed at them. In camp nothing belongs to you. Here in camp we have communism. Forward march, leader. And if it was communism, then what was there for them to object to? That is what they had dedicated their lives to. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this reading today. It's one of my all-time favourite books. I think they should do it in school. I know in Russia they actually have it as part of the curriculum. It's a phenomenal book and it's utterly heartbreaking. I think it's essential reading for everyone if you want to understand totalitarianism and how governments go off the rails. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe, and I'll speak to you next time. Bye bye.